l'a déjà dit durant cette conférence, la tech est un environnement en perpétuel renouvellement. Ce qui se retrouve aussi au niveau des mouvements d'équipe. Un ou une collègue quitte l'entreprise et son remplaçant ou sa remplaçante prend déjà le relais. Et à chaque fois, la bonne intégration du nouveau collaborateur ou de la nouvelle collaboratrice est un enjeu crucial pour la pérennité du collectif. Et avec le contexte actuel de travail à distance, cela rend un peu plus difficile la communication au sein de l'équipe avec le ou la nouvelle collègue. Le témoignage à venir est celui d'une Américaine qui se définit elle-même comme quelqu'un qui aide les développeurs et les développeuses à écrire du meilleur code, cela grâce à l'empathie. Pour elle, l'empathie n'est pas qu'une qualité, c'est avant tout une compétence, et elle va vous le prouver maintenant avec une retranscription dans votre quotidien de tech. Place à Andrea Goulet, cofondatrice de la société Corgibytes.
Hi, my name is Andrea Goulet, and I have a really interesting path in software. I spent the first 10 years of my career as a writer, and specifically, I worked on websites. I helped small businesses attract more customers. And in order to do this, I really had to hone a specific skill. In addition to writing, I also needed to understand other people. I needed to understand the mindset of somebody, especially if I wasn't able to interact with them. And that particular skill is empathy. After that, the next 10 years of my career, I spent as the CEO of a software company that specializes in helping teams pay down technical debt and improve their legacy code. Interesting switch. Don't have time to go into the story of how I got there, but one of the things that was really neat is from these 2 decades, I saw a really important link between empathy, or the lack thereof, and the quality of a code base. And as I was starting to navigate this and explore this, I started noticing that empathy isn't really valued in software as it is in other professions. Because I would go to conferences and people would constantly ask, are you technical or non-technical? I don't look like the stereotypical coder, but I would get asked this question all the time. And beneath the surface of all of this is, do you look like me? Are you smart enough? Does your view matter? Do you have the right degree? Do you even belong here? And it took me many years to really unpack this. But in the history of computer science, there has been a bias that has been built upon year. And that bias is that technical skills, which we consider to be logic, reason, and math, are more important than non-technical skills or soft skills like emotion, communication, and empathy. But in reality, that's not the case. I mean, they're the same, right? They're both important. And they're also both technical because you can get just as deep and just as specific about empathy and its application in the code as you can about the underlying mathematical principles. So as we start to look at this, we can open our eyes a little bit more and start to see that empathy is all around us as we code. I mean, let's think about, why do we even have compiled languages? Why don't we code in ones and zeros? Like, that's all the computer needs, right? Like, why bother just compiling everything down? Well, it's because Grace Hopper was a mathematician, and she was like, well, it's really easy. I'm good at coding in binary, but there are other people who don't have the skill. And so wouldn't it be nice if they could just type out the word print and something printed? And so she developed, natural languages. We also see this in terms of refactoring, right? Like, why do we need to make code easier to read, right? Well, it's for other humans so that they can be more productive, right? Everything, again, just compiles ones and zeros. We might get a small optimism, or optimization, but the biggest reason is that it's helpful to other people. We can start to look at this all over the place. And when we start to understand empathy on a technical level, we can see how its application as we code becomes really important. Now, it's also important to note that if we ignore empathy, we can have huge implications, right? Legacy code, right? Like, legacy code is code that's difficult to work with and difficult to understand. And part of the reason that it's difficult to understand is that people haven't left their empathy along the way. Like they haven't really thought about the people who will come after them. A lot of times this comes from like coding really fast, a lot of technical debt. But in addition to the code quality and how easy it is to work with, we can also come up with a lot of organizational problems too, such as really toxic cultures, less diversity, lower productivity because things are harder to work with and we're not communicating as well, unhappy customers, right? We lose market share, and all of that leads to lower profit and silos and just not good stuff. So we want to focus on empathy, but we want to do it in a skillful way. Now, when I first started talking to developers and engineers about using empathy, I was guilty of doing what I call throwing around empathy confetti. And this was because I knew what empathy was on a really technical level. I was like, empathy is so important. Like, have empathy. You need more empathy. And people would ask me very specific contexts of like, how do I do this? Right? What are some concrete ways that I can implement empathy in the code base? And I was like, I don't know. Well, just have more empathy. And that wasn't a very useful answer, right? But it's taken me a while to kind of dig deeper. And so we'll start to look at that. Now, instead of treating empathy as confetti, of just like, empathy is going to save everything, empathy is amazing, empathy is important, right? We want to think of empathy instead as a scalpel, right? Empathy requires immense technical skill. You have to understand what empathy is and what it isn't, and be able to explain it and articulate it, right? And use it effectively. It's also important that empathy can both help, but if it's used unskillfully, you can cause harm too. Empathy requires precision, and it's just one tool, right? It's not going to solve everything, but it's an important tool that can be used broadly in many different situations, but it's not the end all be all to everything. Now, let's look at what empathy is. Let's look at some different definitions and kind of see if we can draw some patterns. So Indy Young, I love Indy. She's a good friend of mine, and she wrote a book called Practical Empathy. And this was one of the first books that really convinced me that empathy is a deeply technical topic. And it's great for folks who are in computer science. Empathy, she describes, is a noun. It is a thing. Empathy is an understanding that you develop about another person. And the way that you do that, it's very data-driven, right? We think about going out and collecting that information and then really understanding it. Empathizing then is the use of that understanding. That's the action. Brene Brown has this definition. Empathy is connecting to the emotions that underpin an experience. And her research also shows that empathy is the antidote to shame. So if we have lots of toxic cultures, or we're not as diverse, or we see shame everywhere where people feel like they don't belong and we're struggling for human connection, empathy is a really great tool to help combat that. Helen Rees is a neuroscientist. So her research focuses on the brain, right? And her book, The Empathy Effect, she talks about empathy being best understood as the human capacity that consists of several different facets, and they all work together to help us as people be moved by the plights and emotions of others. And there's other researchers too. So Jamil Zaki, he works in the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab out in California. And his book, he talks about how, people think about empathy just as a feeling, but it's more complicated than that. Empathy refers to several different ways that we respond to each other. What are those different ways? Well, there's a lot of different subtypes of empathy, which should give you an indication that it's pretty technical. And we'll go over just 6 today. So the main categories of empathy, you have cognitive, which is rational. This is intellectual. It's identifying what somebody else feels. This is very data-driven and very analytical. We also have emotional empathy, which is kind of the default. This is what people think of when we think of empathy kind of in general. Then we have empathetic concern, which can also be called compassion. And that is, I understand how you feel. I then tap into my own feelings to feel how you feel. And then I'm so moved by that I want to take an action to relieve that suffering that you have. There are also some different subcategories that are worth mentioning. So we have self-empathy, right? If we only have empathy for everybody else, but we don't include ourselves, that can be hard and there can be some consequences there. Mirrored empathy is a little less conscious, right? We have mirror neurons in our brains that we are conditioned as a species to act like other people. Like we are a social species. And one way that this shows up is, for example, if I was presenting this live in France, I would probably have a little bit of a French accent from talking to all of the different people. I notice that when I go abroad, my, cadence and the way I talk, it shifts slightly, and it's not conscious, but it just, happens because my mirror neurons are firing. And then there's also personal distress. So this would be if you watch a blooper reel or something, or you see somebody fall off a motorcycle, or you watch a horror movie, and if you see somebody else get hurt or, experience physical pain, then you feel kind of that sharp feeling yourself. All right, so empathy. So we all understand it so that we can learn about it and apply it to our code bases. All right, so empathy is not character-based. Empathy is a skill, right? It's not that you're born with empathy or not. Empathy isn't like adult height where you're born and then you stay there. Empathy is more like language where just navigating the world, you kind of learn it. And there are incredibly few people who don't have the capacity for empathy. If you are watching this, you have the capacity for empathy. But it's a skill that we can hone and develop, kind of like language, right? It's something that we just use and don't necessarily think of. Empathy is not also telepathy. So empathy is not just walking into a room and then feeling what other people are feeling. We see this a lot in like sci-fi. So if we think of Star Trek Next Generation, we think of, Deanna Troi, and she's this empath who just like magically understands other people. And there are people who I would say are probably more sensitive than others. But at the same time, it's not an on or off, right? It's not like we're, a complete telepath or we're an android and a robot and we don't understand anything. We can hone this skill. Empathy is not simple. Hopefully you're seeing that so far. It's also not passive. It's not something that happens to you. And empathy is not giving people permission, right? Just because you're seeking to understand someone and possibly connect to how they're feeling doesn't mean that you accept their behavior or that you navigate the world without boundaries. These are in the middle column, we see kind of like empathy, but needs a qualifier. So empathy is a feeling. Emotional empathy is, but cognitive empathy is also really important. Walking in someone else's shoes. This is something that we hear a lot of, but we're never going to be able to truly understand somebody's experience from birth to death and experience all of that. The best we can do is walk beside someone for a little bit and really do our best to understand their perspective. Empathy is something that you're born with. Yes, and everyone else is too, right? So it's not that it's necessarily special, especially if you weren't trained in empathy, right? There's a skills gap, just like I had experiences where I didn't learn how to code early in my career, but I learned, right? It's a skill. And empathy is also intuition. Intuition is born out of lots of experience and practice, and then it becomes more easy to draw upon, and you use it in kind of less of a really focused cognitive way. Empathy definitely is a skill, right? The research shows this. You can grow your capacity for empathy. Empathy is also data-driven, so it's about understanding others, and it's both rational and emotional, right? It is balanced. Empathy is complex and it's also active. So empathy can go wrong, right? If we have only cognitive empathy, but we lack emotional empathy, then it can lead to manipulation or scams, right? Like that's somebody intellectually understanding how somebody else feels, but not caring. We can also go the other way, where we care too much and we're driven only by emotions. But then we may have ethics problems because we focus only on this one person, but we forget how, helping that one person may have a bigger impact on broader groups. So a lot of ethics concerns talk about this. And finally, like I mentioned earlier, you got to consider yourself in all of this too. If you have emotional empathy for everyone else, but you keep yourself out of that group, you're going to become a doormat and your needs are going to be trampled. So empathy is kind of like a mixing board, right? We have all different types and we need to balance them in different situations and use it skillfully. So how can we use empathy as we code? Well, we can look at several different skills and kind of look at this as a hierarchy. Now, it's important to note that this isn't like you have to master what's on the bottom. You can totally work all the way in the pyramid, but the skills on the bottom are going to be the most foundational. And if you're struggling or just getting started with empathy or you don't really understand it, the skills on the bottom are going to be the ones that will give you the biggest boost as you go on your empathy journey. So first is developing an empathy mindset. And what this is recognizing that empathy is a valid skill and that it helps in software. And it's treating empathy just like you would any other coding concept, right? Like if you want to go out and learn JavaScript or, about Kubernetes, right? You would read a lot of books and do a bunch of classes, right? There's a lot out there about empathy. And so really learning about it. Rejecting false dichotomies. And so that's that you have hard skills or soft skills, or you are technical or non-technical. No, we need all of it, right? So it's not like you have one or the other. And then also treating computers as tools, not people. You are using the computer as a tool to create something or enhance something or improve something for other people. Next, we have clearing your lens, right? If we're going to look at somebody else's point of view, we need to make sure that our own perspective is nice and clear. And all of us navigate the world with our own experiences and our own bias and our own kind of heuristics for how we form judgments. And that's okay, right? Like that's normal and human. But we do want to be aware of where our own biases are. And then we also want to evaluate the information sources that we're using. And are we using things that have bias built into them? We want to practice listening while not injecting our own feelings or our own story into what somebody else is saying. And dehumanizing and objectifying behavior, we really need to nip that in the bud real quick. Next is pointing our perspective. Right? So once we understand where we are, we understand empathy, it's all good. Okay, now we're going to get into like really understanding other people. And with this, it's understanding that if we are trying to empathize with a group, we can have challenges. Right? We really want to try to focus on individuals that we know are even better because then we can connect to that emotion. And remembering that if we only rely on demographics, so women aged 30 to 35 feel this way. No, not necessarily. I mean, you can make generalizations, but that actually, if you try to create empathy based on that demographic, what you're actually going to end up with is entrenching an existing stereotype. So seeking out people, right? So an example here would be, let's say that you're like, oh, I hate typing up these release notes. Why do I have to do this? This is annoying, right? Well, it's remembering that your colleague, Shonda, she talked about how when there's really good release notes, it saves her 10 hours of work because she has fewer customers call in asking about what happened or what a certain feature does. And so what you're doing then is saying, okay, I care about Shonda, I care about my colleague, I care about how she feels. So I'm going to do this so that I can benefit her, right? We also want to remember that there's often more than one audience. Some typical audiences we think of are our customers, but there are also ourselves in the future or people who might be joining our team as well. And it's really going out and then proactively finding that understanding. Communication, this is really important to empathy too. So the way that we express ourselves and also the way we hear, right? We want to leave good artifacts for other people to find, right? Like think about how we're writing our commit messages and our logs, and are we writing code that is self-revealing so that somebody can come in and easily understand what all the variable names are, right? We want to think about the channel and the style and the structure of our communication. And then another really great place, if you're just getting started with this, is to just take a pause before delivering something and just review and consider other people's perspectives before you press send. And then finally, we have share, right? So we want to regularly reflect on experiences and create psychological safety so that people feel comfortable sharing their opinion. And we want to be brave because sharing honestly can take a lot of courage. And finally, there's systems, right? We want to invest in the systems and the structures in our organizations that will foster an environment of empathy. So a couple of last thoughts, right? I know this is a lot of information, but it's not possible to be perfect, right? Like, you're never going to really understand everyone. So try to put the idea of perfection aside, which is hard. I'm a recovering perfectionist myself, so I know how hard that is. But instead, we want to focus on progress. We want to recognize that the goal is to do better every day than we did yesterday. And that if enough people do this, then we can make really big gains really fast. So some key takeaways. Empathy is a technical skill and it's important to software. Ignoring empathy has consequences, right? We want to learn what empathy is and what it isn't and be able to adjust appropriately. We can make empathy a part of our daily development if we know where to look. And finally, we want to seek progress, not perfection. I know this is a lot, right? Think of this as a bibliography, so I'll just kind of pause here for just a second if you want to take a screenshot. But these are the sources that I used for this particular talk. Feel free, there is so much interesting information out there that is worth diving into. Books, articles, peer-reviewed research. There is a whole lot there. So with that, thank you very much for having me, and good luck on your empathy journey.